Thank you to the patrons for supporting the channel. Welcome back. Today, as voted on by my patrons, we're covering Team Fortress 2. This is sort of similar to my Garry's Mod video, where it's not really a horror game, but it has a special place in my heart, and I have a lot of things to say about it. From gameplay to development to community, we're talking about it all. So let's just get started. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about my personal history with the game. Much like with Garry's Mod, it was one of the first games I ever got on Steam and is my second most played game of all time. But let me say this up front. I am not an expert at this game. I haven't studied all the gameplay techniques, my aim isn't impeccable, I haven't mastered every class. TF2 for me has always been about the community. I'm prefacing that because I realize that I may make a few mistakes, and my gameplay might not be perfect. I appreciate TF2 on a nostalgia, game design, and development level, but that doesn't mean I'm great at it. In any case, I started playing post-MVM, and the reason was because, well, when I first started, my parents didn't like all the blood and gore, so I was allowed to play when I was fighting robots. I have a lot of good memories of MVM, playing with friends over Skype, trying and failing to beat Nightmare Mode, but that wasn't actually my first time playing. The first time I played TF2 was at my friend's house. He let me take a turn on the game he was playing. I tried Heavy and Soldier, but landed on Sniper because he had the SMG, and it was the closest thing to a regular FPS gun. It was on the community map Trade Center B1. I have an announcement about that map at the end of the video, but for now, let's just talk about that map some more. Trade Center B1 is probably my favorite map in TF2. Not because it's the best designed, but because it perfectly encapsulates so much of the TF2 experience, and I've spent so many hours on that map. The main area is small and easily campable, so there's almost always chaos on the battlefield. Engineers setting up 100 sentry nests outside spawn, snipers killing each other over the balcony, soldiers trying to rocket jump onto the big rock. The sniper area was a perfect place to test your aiming skills, the soccer area for goofing off, and the gallery was just filled with errors. Then there was the exploit that let engineers set up teleporters in their spawn, meaning if you coordinated, you could get an enemy spy into the other team's base. And of course, most community servers had a roll the dice feature, which would allow you to get random effects, so there'd be constant crits, no clipping, and tiny little pyros running around. The point is, Trade Center B1 was great, and it's the map that facilitated my love for this game. With some of my own history of the game out of the way, let's talk about the gameplay. This may seem dramatic, but I legitimately think Team Fortress 2 is the perfect class-based shooter. When you compare it to its contemporaries like Overwatch and Siege, nothing else really compares, and I'll explain why. Firstly, each character is wholly unique. There are only 9 classes, and each of them has a completely unique usage. Unlike something like Overwatch and Rainbow Six, where you end up getting some classes with a lot of overlap, every TF2 class has its own purpose and plays completely differently. Now, there are some balance issues, but when compared to its contemporaries, it's nowhere near the same. Every class, at least with the stock weapons, are perfectly balanced against each other. Even a sniper or spy can take on a heavy or pyro with a reasonable amount of skill. Almost every class has a specific counter, and none are the obviously overpowered or obviously underpowered choice. You can play any of them and do poorly or do really well. It depends more on your experience with the class and less on the class itself. Now, I mentioned stock weapons. There are many different unlockable weapons for all the classes that range from gimmicky to game-changing, but none are good enough to make the stock weapons obsolete. Mostly, they hone in on something specific while adding a disadvantage somewhere else. Even with the weapons that are famously overpowered like the Flog or the Conch, it's not obvious picks because they have their downsides, taking away Air Blast or removing a secondary weapon. It's legitimately rare to see a game like this that is so well balanced and stay that way for most of its life. Not to say there aren't balancing issues, but they're not on the scale of something like Overwatch or Siege, and there is a specific reason for that. Other games like Overwatch and Siege have one big problem. In order to keep the community active and keep updating the game, they've taken the route of adding new characters. Overwatch has 32 heroes, Siege has 60. When you've got that many characters and they're constantly being added, of course there's going to be some that do the same job, or some underpowered and some are overpowered. You need to rebalance the entire game character by character every time you add something. And the more characters they add, the more weird little abilities they give them. Team Fortress 2 has had 9 classes since the beginning, and besides some overhauls or weapon additions, have not really changed them, at least in their role in the game. Things aren't overcomplicated, and there's not choice paralysis or issues with rebalancing the game every month. They were able to keep the community engaged in other ways, which we'll get into later, but mostly because of the strength of the core gameplay. Okay, I've gone on long enough without talking about any of the classes individually, so let's give a quick rundown of each of the 9 classes. Although with some of the subclasses that completely changed the game, there's something probably closer to like 10 or 15. First is the offense classes, Scout, Pyro, and Soldier. Scout is equipped by default with a scattergun, a lever-action shotgun, a pistol, and a bat. He's the fastest class in the game and can deal a lot of damage. However, he's low health and has very little range. This means Scout is best utilized when flanking the enemy in close quarters or getting in and out as fast as possible, dodging damage, packing a punch, and getting the hell out of there. Soldier is equipped with a rocket launcher, a shotgun, and a shovel. He's got a good amount of health, but he can still die pretty quickly if he doesn't position himself well. He's slow, but surprisingly maneuverable thanks to the rocket jump, a technique where you jump and shoot your rocket at the ground at the same time, sending you flying into the air. This means he can get from place to place pretty quickly, gaining good vantage points and shooting to the front line as fast as possible. And his splash damage makes him perfectly suited for the front line, doing as much damage as possible in the parts of the battlefield where the most players are. And his higher health means he's ideal for staying on the objective. Pyro is equipped with a close-range flamethrower that can deal lasting fire damage, a shotgun, and an axe. Pyro's lack of range and lower health means you'll ideally want to be flanking like Scout, but Pyro's lower speeds mean you'll have to play a little bit differently. As Pyro, you can also play a more supportive role because your air blast can extinguish teammates that may have been set on fire by enemy Pyros, and it can also reflect projectiles like rockets and grenades back at the enemy. In defense, there's Demoman, Heavy, and Engineer. Demoman is equipped with a grenade launcher, a remote-activated sticky bomb launcher, and a bottle. With stock Demoman, the splash explosive damage makes him ideal for hitting multiple targets like the Soldier, but his defensive nature means he's better for crowd control and setting traps. There is a whole other way to play him though, the Demo Knight. These are the first of the game-changing items. Demoman is able to equip a sword instead of a bottle and a shield instead of a sticky bomb launcher. The sword has a much longer melee range and more damage, while the shield allows him to build up a charge where he can shoot forward at high speeds. This turns him from a crowd-control defensive class into a more offensive class. There are tons of other things he can do, like trimping, but that's where we'll leave it for now. Heavy is probably the most easily understandable. Big guy, big gun. Slow moving, but a lot of health. Each bullet doesn't do a ton of damage, but his output speed and amount of ammo means he can easily mow down enemy after enemy. He's perfect for defending a point and being a damage sponge. Engineer is a little more interesting. His shotgun and pistols aren't the best weapons of the game, but then again, he's not doing the fighting most of the time. He has the ability to build an automated sentry gun, which can slowly be built into 3 levels, eventually having 2 miniguns and a rocket launcher. He can also build a teleporter and a health and ammo dispenser. He's ideal for defense, but he can also be a big target for explosive damage classes like Demoman and Soldier, and the Spy has a very special way to deal with him, which we'll talk about later. And finally in support, we have Medic, Sniper, and Spy. Medic is really what all healer classes in the modern day are based on. He's equipped with a Medigun, which allows him to shoot a healing beam to one player at a time. Healing players builds up an Uber Charge, which is a special effect that, depending on what Medigun he's using, can range from invincibility to critical damage. He can be great for pocketing high-value targets like Heavy, or for running around the front lines, keeping the team alive. Sniper is equipped with a sniper rifle, a small SMG, and a machete. He can deal extremely high amounts of damage, but is very vulnerable. For that reason, he mostly stays near the back, finding a good sightline and taking out enemies from afar. However, in another game-changing weapon, he can become a more front-lining character. The Huntsman, a bow and arrow, means he'll probably have to be a bit closer, but he can deal extremely high amounts of damage. Combine that with the Jarate, a literal jar of piss that when thrown can make enemies take extra damage, he can be a great offensive / support class when played as the Huntsman. And finally, the Spy. This is probably the character with the most individual little intricacies, which is probably why most Spy mains have a superiority complex, but anyway, he has a very low amount of health and isn't particularly fast. His gun is just a revolver and he will usually die very fast if he goes right into battle. Luckily, that's not what he's there for. He has the ability to go invisible and disguise himself as any player on the other team. When he's behind someone, he can do a backstab which instantly kills that player. He also has a sapper, which is a device that will disable and slowly damage any and all engineer buildings. He's not great for direct combat, but when used correctly, he can change the game from behind enemy lines. So there you go, a basic brief rundown of all the classes in the game. Now I'm not an expert at any of them, let alone all of them, but that's the basic idea. Now all of that would be great, but without game modes and maps that are designed specifically around these classes, well, there wouldn't be much use to it. So let's talk about the game modes and maps of TF2. There are a ton of game modes, but we'll just go through these main ones for now. Arena, a multi-round perma-deathmatch mode. Capture the flag. 2 bases, 2 flags. You get it. Control point. There are a lot of different subversions of this, but generally there's an attacking team that captures the points and a defensive team that tries to defend them. King of the Hill is similar to Control Point, but there is one neutral point, the hill, that both teams try to stay on as long as possible. Payload. In this game mode, one attacking team attempts to escort a cart into the defending team's base. Payload Race. Similar to Payload, but both teams have a cart and are trying to race each other into the other person's base. Now there are a bunch more community game modes and non-core game modes that you can play, but those are the main ones you'll be playing if you just hop into a game. And as you can tell, there's a lot of variety, so each map that's made has to fit all the different classes and whatever game mode it is set on. And for the most part, they do it relatively well, although obviously to varying degrees. To sort of go over some of the main staples of a Team Fortress 2 map, I'll use these as examples. Upward, 2-Fort, High Tower, and Harvest. One of the first things you start to notice on TF2 maps is the sniper sightlines. Sometimes they're really obvious like in 2-Fort, but in something like PL Upward, they're more subtle. The best maps have clear sightlines that don't give the sniper full view of the map, forcing the sniper to move around as the battle moves. And the better snipers will usually avoid the most obvious places to avoid being seen so quickly, unless they're just doing a straight up sniper v sniper duel. There's also a good deal of alternate ways to move around the map. 2-Fort has multiple ways in and out of the intel room. There's the sewers versus the bridge, or for the more mobile classes, over the battlefield. Harvest is a pretty open map with multiple smaller structures spread throughout, giving a good amount of cover and routes for flanking classes like Scout and Pyro. On payload maps like Upward and High Tower, the cart will usually have multiple choke points that the attacking team needs to break through to push the cart. A well-coordinated team on a well-designed map, however, will have multiple routes for flanking classes and support classes to lessen the impact of the enemy team, while something like a heavier demo man can help push the cart through the choke point. There's also usually good protection and cover for certain areas for sentry nests, plenty of room for things like rocket jumping, and a good balance of terrain for attackers and defenders. Now, different maps do this well to varying degrees, but that's what to look out for when playing these Valve official maps. There are a few other game modes I feel like I should mention that don't fit into the core game modes but are pretty important, starting with MVM. Man vs. Machine, aka MVM, is probably the best introduction of a PvE mode into any PvP game I've ever seen. A wave-based game mode consisting of waves of robots of varying types and abilities trying to move a bomb into a pit at the end of the map. From the giant crit rapid-fire soldiers to just low-health melee-only scout bots to giant tanks. The players earn money by collecting it off the defeated robots, and in between waves can upgrade their weapons and characters in various ways. From absurd speed and jump height to becoming ubered for a period of time to an almost endless amount of bullets and high damage. With a variety of maps made specifically for this mode and a nightmare mode, some of my favorite TF2 memories were made in this game mode. There's also Scream Fortress, game modes that are available around Halloween that have a strange mix of PvP and PvE, along with things like spells, a hell dimension, and a whole variety of spooky stuff. Depending on what year or version of Scream Fortress you're playing will change exactly how it works, but usually you have 2 other teams fighting each other with a boss that will spawn, and both teams have to work together to kill it. Monoculus, Marasmus, the Horseless Headless Horseman, etc. Again, not the most important game mode of the game, but still definitely a great set of memories and another addition to how TF2 has, or at least used to keep the game alive. There are also just a ton of mechanics in the game that make learning each character very unique. Pyro's Air Blast has a variety of different uses, and the most skilled Pyros can even rocket jump with an enemy rocket by reflecting it in a certain way. Rocket jumping is more than just pushing yourself up with knockback. There's a lot of intricacies to making the most out of your rocket jump, and specialized weapons can add whole new angles. Shields can allow Demo Man to ramp off certain surfaces, giving him an entirely new sense of mobility. And because so many of the weapons aren't strictly hit scan like Sniper, learning how to play doesn't just mean getting inhuman aim. It means actually understanding the different gameplay elements of the character. Now, gameplay wise, I'm sure I could talk for hours and hours more, but we still have a bunch of parts of the games we haven't even talked about, including what I think is the biggest reason I joined the game, and I think something that drew a lot of other people to the game as well: the community. The Team Fortress 2 community is a lot smaller than it once was, mostly because of how Valve has chosen to handle the game as of late, but we'll get into that later. For now, I just want to talk about the things that make the TF2 community especially unique and such a huge draw for people, starting with one of my favorite examples of anything that's happened in a video game: the Great Conga, aka the Bread update. June 18th, 2014, Valve released the Love and War update for TF2, which became known as the Bread update for reasons we'll talk about later. One of the things that was added was the Conga taunt. Taunts have been a staple of TF2, starting as weapon and class-specific animations that you could use to taunt an opponent after killing them. But as things evolved, they began to take on other uses, and the Conga was amazing. If one person had the Conga taunt, everyone else could join in, creating a Conga line essentially. And so for the next 2 weeks straight, every single Team Fortress 2 server was just one big Conga line. Red and Blue, Heavy, and Scout coming together to just dance seemingly endlessly around in circles. TF2 is such a goofy game, and the sense of camaraderie that comes with the community creates opportunities for things like that to happen. I even made a video about it way back in the day.
Germa versus Star, everybody wants to see this happen.
The community around creating content around TF2 was really at its peak around the Germa and Stir area, at least in my memory. You might not know this, but Germa 985
Goofy! From McDonald's!
Started as a TF2 commentary channel. The commentary community surrounding TF2, especially during this era, kept a healthy discussion about the game going, and also brought in a ton of new players.
Oh, look it!
Meanwhile, SFM and Gmod creators like Winglet and the late great Kideo706 made some fantastic pieces of story/animation content. This is some of the content that inspired one of the biggest staples of TF2, voice mashing, where you, much like in YouTube Poops, try to take voice lines from the game and official animations and combine them into dialogue that you want.
There is your mama in a box! Oh. He's right!
Now with 15 AI, it's easier to get custom voice lines, but there's still an art to voice mashing. I really don't know if I can fully emphasize how big of a deal the animation side of the community is, but maybe this will help. With Source Filmmaker being open to anyone, the animation community got so big that Valve started an official animation contest where the winner was awarded a Saxi, which is an actual melee weapon you can use in the game. There are some legitimately amazing works of animation and filmmaking, and it really shows how much Valve used to care about the TF2 community. Another thing that the community has been great at is creating their own game modes and maps, which they then host on community servers. From the asymmetric Saxton Hale mode, which later turned into Freak Fortress, to TF2 Hunger Games, to weirder game modes and servers like Mirror's Edge Races and Slender Survival. The ability to create your own plugins, maps, and servers means the sky is really the limit with TF2. And a lot of the maps like CTF Turbine ended up becoming official maps. In the current era, this community involvement is one of the biggest things keeping TF2 alive. Along with game modes and servers, the modding community is huge. Not in the sense that they add new characters and such, but more like added sounds, reskins, and HUD updates. From ridiculous soundbite additions to brand new animations and models for weapons, and even entire remakes or graphic overhauls for things like lighting. In a more traditional sense of the mod, a big team of community members are working on what is currently a playable reimagining of the game based on some of the older concepts of the game. It adds a 10th class, the Civilian, and a new game modes, weapons, and addition of 4 teams: red, blue, green, and yellow. Again, I think it's just a great example of how dedicated the community around this game is. Finally, I just want to talk about some of the memes surrounding Team Fortress 2. I mean, there's too many for me to go over them all, but they're an integral part of the community. From the earlier stuff like,
nope, man! game!
And
Gay Ben.
to more recent stuff like Engineer Gaming and Heavy is Dead. Here's just a quick supercut of all the ones I could think of off the top of my head.
Scrumpy!
Bonus ducks!
Put this pain is your mother!
Now, I couldn't make a Team Fortress 2 video without talking about the hats and the economy. It's one of the most well-known and integral parts of the game. In May of 2009, Valve would add hats to the game, which eventually just turned into general cosmetics. The ability to customize your characters added a whole new level of personality and individuality. And then they added rarity. The ability to get certain cosmetics was limited to crates, which would randomly drop and you'd need keys to open. Then there were unusual versions of cosmetics, meaning they were more rare and had special particle effects. There was also different classifications for items like cosmetics and guns, like genuine, strange, and vintage. In much later updates, there were weapon skins that you could unlock. Rarity and eventually price would lead to the concepts of status being involved. Having a really rare unusual meant that you either had spent a lot of money on the game or a lot of time. With all these different types of items and classifications, it's no wonder an economy grew up around it, especially with the built-in item trading system and the fact that you could sell items in the Steam store for real money. The only thing that was left to really create a full, vacuum, stable economy was a currency. Certain weapons and cosmetics in the game can be crafted using other items. The main ingredients for crafting are different types of scrap metal, which you can get from breaking down existing items. Metal, along with crate keys, became the standard currency of trackable value, with regular scrap being the lowest and keys being the highest. And so began the TF2 economy. And when the economy was established, it grew. It works like a real economy with economic crashes, destabilization, high points and low points. Third-party marketplaces popped up, and because real money was attached to the value of keys and items sold on the Steam marketplace, the stakes began to raise. To be honest, myself and in my younger days, my mother have spent an ungodly amount of money on TF2 cosmetics. Some of these can be expensive. The TF2 economy is so sophisticated that it's actually used in research studies and as an example to how an economy works when created in sort of a vacuum. None of the items are necessary to play the game, so all of the value is attributed. There is inflation, value change, and a growing wealth gap. It's all pretty interesting, and again, it's a great example because it's mostly created without some outside world of politics and global interference. Well, there have been some times when Valve had to step in, like the Crate Depression of 2019. In 2019, a patch was released for Team Fortress 2 that accidentally introduced a glitch where certain crates would give you a 100% chance of unboxing an unusual. And once the community realized this, the market went crazy. Crate prices skyrocketed due to frenzy buying and resell schemes, while unusual prices plummeted, some even making it as low as 10 cents. And when Valve finally intervened, they ended up making all unusuals locked from being traded. After a while, they unlocked the first unusual a user opened, but any after that were unable to be traded or sold. But in a lot of ways, the damage had already been done, and it took a long time for the market to stabilize again. And during that time the glitch was active, it was estimated over 125,000 unusuals were opened. Now, I've hinted throughout this video that the TF2 community is not really in the best spot nowadays, but to fully realize where it is now, we have to talk about where it started. So let's talk about the history and development. Team Fortress 2's story starts with Quake. Quake and Valve have always had a closeness. Half-Life 1 was created using a modified version of Quake's engine. While Wolfenstein and Doom may have invented the first-person shooter, Quake revolutionized it. True 3D, even multiplayer. Very quickly, a modding community was created around the game, and one of the biggest mods for Quake was Team Fortress, a multiplayer mod that consisted of 2 teams and 10 classes similar to Team Fortress 2 Classic, which is, you know, why they have those classes in TF2 Classic. Scout, Sniper, Soldier, Demolitions Man, Combat Medic, Heavy Weapons Guy, Pyromaniac, Civilian, Spy, and Engineer. While similar, a lot of the specific mechanics of these classes have changed a lot from then to now. Valve quickly saw the potential in the mod team and worked with them to develop Team Fortress Classic on their own Gold Source engine. This was a refined version of the original mod with graphic improvements and some minor changes. Now that the Team Fortress IP was under the Valve umbrella, they began the long journey to create Team Fortress 2. The first build of Team Fortress 2 that the public saw was Team Fortress 2 Brotherhood of Arms. This was going to be a more realistic military shooter with vehicles and commanders and reworked classes to be more realistic and strategic. However, in the end, Valve would scrap that idea. The next big version of Team Fortress 2 would be Team Fortress 2 Invasion. This one is a little harder to piece together because most of the information we have is from lost game files and other information that wasn't supposed to necessarily be public. But it seems like it was going to be a big reimagining of the formula, with the two teams being humans versus aliens. A lot of the graphics and styles seem to be similar to Half-Life 2, all wrapped up in a sci-fi dystopia aesthetic. But in time, even this version of Team Fortress 2 would be scrapped in favor of...
Welcome to Team Fortress 2. After 9 years in development, hopefully it will have been worth the wait.
Finally, the style and gameplay we know. Some minor changes would be made between the reveal and the actual game. Scout would get a scattergun instead of an SMG, Demo Man would get a sticky bomb instead of dynamite, and the art style would be more refined, but generally, this is the game we know and love. And so would begin Team Fortress 2's very long life. One of the biggest things that contributed to Team Fortress 2's success by far was Valve's official Meet the videos. Highly detailed and animated introductions to each class, oozing with personality, really fleshing out the characters. Some were in a documentary/interview style, while others were narratives surrounding the characters. These not only brought in tons of new players, but really pushed the limits of what Valve could do as developers in and outside of the game itself. And speaking of ways Valve developed characters outside of the game... In 2011, the first TF2 comic was released. The Team Fortress comic started out as little one-offs of character interaction, many times something to do with new items added to the game. But eventually, a fully fledged story was created with detailed artwork and a followable narrative. And it's fucking incredible. Seriously, whether you like playing the game or not, the Team Fortress comics are free, beautifully illustrated, and hilarious while also having characters you really care about. They introduce the characters from the Team Fortress Classic, they add all sorts of weird lore about the characters. I cannot recommend these enough, although, just know, they haven't had a new issue since 2017, so the story is sort of left indefinitely on a cliffhanger. As a side note, all of the music in this game is fantastic, and it's a full orchestra recording for all of it, and it's just amazing. And Valve is really cool about how, letting people use their music in videos. Now, this won't be a full chronological order of all the updates because that would just kind of be boring, but it will talk about different types of updates and some important ones, and mostly trying to give you an impression of how Valve used to keep the community alive without having to add new characters every month. First, in 2011, the game went free to play, opening it up to a whole new audience of people. Then again, they added cosmetics and hats and rarity and all of that stuff, which just changed the game entirely. Then there were the Versus updates, Pyro versus Heavy, Demo Man versus Soldier, and Spy versus Sniper. These sort of Versus updates would pit the classes against each other, sometimes with community voting, and then add new weapons for the classes. Of course, every Halloween and Christmas there were the Smithmas and Scream Fortress updates, which added new cosmetics and weapons and balance changes, and in the case of Scream Fortress, a whole new game mode. The update I remember most, though, was the Love and War update, aka the Bread update. This added the famous Conga emote, but also came along with new items and skins and a huge amount of hype from the community. The reason we call it the Bread update is because a lot of the items and theme was bread related, including adding the possibility to have bread appear when you teleport. Why was everything so bread themed? Well, that would be because of Expiration Date. Expiration Date was a 15-minute Valve official Team Fortress 2 short film made in Source Filmmaker.
I got a bucket of chicken.
It is yet another exploration of Team Fortress as a narrative, and it was fantastic. The premise is that teleporting bread in the teleporters creates a giant evil bread monster. So there's that. Interestingly, this was originally going to be a pilot episode for an Adult Swim full TF2 series, but it got stuck in development hell because Valve didn't want to allow for an ad break, so we got this instead. The last update I remember playing during my TF2 heyday was the Gunmetal update, which introduced traditional gun skins into the game that were earned by completing contracts. It was fun while it lasted, but I remember already feeling a stirring in the community at this time. Jungle Inferno was the last major TF2 update since 2017. Since then, there have been patches, some bug fixes here and there, but really it seems like the game has gone by the wayside, and Valve has all but forgotten Team Fortress 2. For this video, I got really back into playing Team Fortress 2, trying out all the different classes, trying to really get better at the game, having fun in new community modes, and Again, I have an announcement at the end of this video for something, but the point is I was having a lot of fun. But I think that speaks more to the core gameplay of Team Fortress 2 than how Valve has handled it. For the most part, even the most die-hard fans of Team Fortress 2 have left. Why? Well, again, it's because there hasn't been a major update since 2017, and it seems to have gone mostly by the wayside. Any added content has been created by the community, occasionally being officially added by Valve. Because of that, no offense to the community creators, but the standards and cohesive feel of TF2 has dissipated. Low updates and not a very engaged developer means that hackers and bots roam free. Recently there was an attempt to make things better, but it hasn't fully fixed the problem. As far as I recall, there are currently somewhere between 3 to 5 part-time developers working on TF2, so not a big team. Clearly, Valve has decided that their time is better spent elsewhere, which I understand, but considering the fairly large player base and the consistent support, it seems weird to nearly abandon it. And a lot of people have criticized Valve for their loose company structure, which means a lot of the time Valve developers are floating around from project to project, which is another reason that the Adult Swim project fell through. As well, it's been speculated that for a long time, Valve hasn't really been interested in making games anymore. Aside from Half-Life Alyx, which although was great, was more of a tech demo for their new engine and VR equipment, they've mostly been invested in Steam and Vive. Maybe Team Fortress 2 will come back to its former glory, but I don't see that being from Valve. I think that would be more of a community-led effort. Personally, I still love Team Fortress 2, and I have so many memories attached to it. I always find myself coming back even so many years later. On that note, I started my own Team Fortress 2 server. There are 10 slots at a time, so if you want to get in, you might have to wait a little bit because it's kind of expensive running a server that is more than 10 slots, but it runs only Trade Center B1 because, as far as I know, there are no other servers running that map, and I wanted to preserve a little bit of history. To join it, you'll have to go into the command console and then put this thing that's on screen or in the description. It'll connect you straight to the server, and yeah, come in. My friends and I hop in there every once in a while, have fun, we taunt and fight and do whatever the hell we want. So yeah, again, I think it's the only server that's running Trade Center B1, so hop in while it's still around. I don't know how long I'm gonna keep it up for, but for now, I plan to just keep it going indefinitely. So that's really all I have to say about Team Fortress 2. Thank you for watching this far if you have. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments and suggest what I should cover next on my Twitter. You should also follow me there because that's where I announce when I'm streaming at twitch.tv/SaganHawks. See you all next time.